Rank the albums. Today I'm having a look at the albums of Spinal Tap, a hard rock band who are very influential to the career of Spinal Tap. I'm working from my CD collection. I know David St. Hubbins objects to their work being published on CD, but he sure didn't object to the royalties. I'm not including the members of Spinal Tap's solo albums in this because, well, I keep them in another room and they're not that nice to listen to. Well, the first album was called Listen to the Flower People, not to be confused with the single with the exact same cover. This is such a breath of fresh air. It was released in 1967 and it really countered the kind of trudgy, heavy hard rock that was going on at the time. It was great to hear Spinal Tap come along, and really you can hear a lot of imitation of this album from the other bands of the era. It's a very strong debut. It's hard to understand how a band of this sound at this point already had the name Spinal Tap. It sounds like a name for the much heavier band they were to become, and it's not even a British term. The follow-up to Listen to the Flower People was called We Are All Flower People, and I actually don't have a copy of that on CD. It has arguably been published on CD, but get this. The version that's published on CD, for some reason, is retitled The Incredible Flight of Icarus P. Anybody, and they removed the original title song, We Are All Flower People. We are all flower people. I can't stand for the woke cancellation of such a brilliant song. I refuse to buy a copy of the album without it. Listen to the Flower People was full of fun individual songs. We Are All is more sequential and thereby even better, but do not accept it without its title track. Since I don't have a copy of their second album, I'm gonna have to find some other CD to represent this in the ranked stack. Just give me a moment. Okay. We Are All Flower People is a better album than Listen to the Flower People. In the late 60s, Spinal Tap's studio material floundered for a bit. I'm ranking just the studio albums, so the next one is Brain Hammer. Honestly, this has a pretty nasty sound. It's famously got the track Big Bottom on it, which is known for using 3 bass guitars. That's a pretty good track, but when there's 6 tracks in a row that just use bass guitars, that's a bit much for me. It's not Spinal Tap at their best. That's going there. That's going there. Then Nerve Damage, which has some industrial sounds on it. There's the sound of a pneumatic drill and a paper shredder and a laminator. I think Spinal Tap's Nerve Damage can be called the earliest example of an industrial album because they crossed a picket line to record it. When you get this, get the 2 CD version, because the second disc has the rare original studio recording of Short and Sweet. And nothing else, but that's pretty good. That's going between the Flower People albums. Next we have Blood Toilet, and this introduces us to a habit that you'll have to get used to with Spinal Tap. It's a pretty good approach to album making. When you make an album, ensure that there is exactly 1 good track on it. And that means that people will buy every album unless they want to wait for a compilation. On this album, they just keep recycling the same riff, and it works best on the tracks when it's in B minor and F minor, not Spinal Tap at their best. Next is Intravenous Demilo, and you do not realize how many classic Spinal tracks are on this one. There's almost 3 of them. Their most essential album yet. The next 2 albums, Sun Never Sweats and Bent for the Rent, I've only ever managed to find on this double album CD from the Pack It In series. Luckily, their quality is about the same. You've got 2 different approaches there. You've got the kind of pretentious prog rock piece, but it's worth the 30 minutes of pretension. The remaining 50 minutes are not worth it. Then on the flip side, Bent for the Rent is Spinal Tap kind of rebranding themselves as a glam band. It's a bit late for that. was it 1976? But it works, it's a pleasant little diversion. They've just come off their best album, and they're still creating two different types of things in which there's a lot to enjoy. Occasionally that enjoyment even reaches the audience. These aren't Spinal Tap at their best, but they're tolerable, and that's what they aim for. You'll notice on all of these CD issues that they have opaque, solid spines, which you don't usually get on audio CDs. You could say it makes the packaging look kind of cheap and homemade, but it's actually a really good feature that Nigel came up with, because listen to this. Do you hear that? It's a Spinal Tap. The next Spinal Tap release was called Rock and Roll Creation. I do not agree with the publishing of that album. I think that Spinal Tap themselves did not consent to those recordings being released. It would be disrespectful of me to include that in this list, because it's shit. Sex is okay. Next we have Shark Sandwich. Completely awesome. Smell the Glove sadly completes the Americanization of Spinal Tap. Of course, this one's pretty well known because it's when they were publishing this that they recorded that horrible documentary. Famously, Spinal Tap were accused of misogyny for this album and the rest of their albums, but I think that's ridiculous. Look at Spinal Tap's history. They have only ever employed heterosexual men, and heterosexual men are the demographic scientifically defined by their love for women. Yeah, this is not Spinal Tap at their best. To cash in on the documentary, because they've got to get something out of it, a compilation album, Spinal Tap Tracks, was also released. This compilation album is not to be confused with the original Smell the Glove. It's a decent listen because it's got their best tracks thus far, but there's no real reason for this to exist. Often when I get to the 80s of someone's career, there's a lot to be embarrassed about, but Spinal Tap quite wisely sat out most of the 80s. They did quietly release a Spinal Tape in 1989. A quiet release according to the charts, at least. Liquid Ice is a bit of a departure. Nigel is rapping through most of this album. It's not Spinal Tap at their best. I think the only track that stands the test of time is I'm Tough. Poorest work so far, really. Then came their majestic return and somewhat rehabilitation in 1992 with Break Like the Wind. They pulled in some amazing guest stars, and it's really the sound of a rejuvenated band. This is one of their best recordings. You can rely on Spinal Tap to make 70s rock music. They made it in the 70s, they made it in the 80s, they also made it in the 60s, here it is in the 90s. There is a bit of a strange habit that they start to establish on this album where they just include some pretty old songs. There's Sun Never Sweats and Rainy Day Sun on this for some reason. But ultimately, the new recordings are great. This is one of their best. I think just below Intravenous. Where to next for a British band with 30 years of experience in the mid-90s in the realm of alternative rock? Well, Spinal Tap can just not be stopped, and in 1997 they invented a new genre. It's called glamge, and it's exactly as good as that sounds. You have to hear the track Kaleidoscape. Really, Spinal Tap are on incredible form for the 90s. That can go just below Break Like the Wind. Then we reached the year 2000, when Spinal Tap's latest offering was called www.spinaltap.album. It's inessential, but better than you'd expect for a band of this age. You should at least hear Chatroom Chinwag. They actually don't perform any of the songs from this album live anymore, but it's understandable given Derek Smalls' history with internet addiction. Then we have the Evil Life of Pat Lanibs, and you have to respect Spinal Tap for their innovation. No other band thought of making a point-and-click adventure game in 2005, but the soundtrack CD is a bit of an afterthought. much like the game, is going beneath sex. Then we have Force It Back, and on this album, Spinal Tap reclaimed their 70s sound, appropriately as they approach their own 70s. It's a bit forced, but it's a decent listen. It's not Spinal Tap at their best. The 70s approach is a pretty good idea, but it makes some of the political tracks like Hey Wedgwood Ben seem a bit irrelevant. And next we have Back from the Dead. It's a strange idea to release an album called Back from the Dead when you had an album of new material less than a year prior. This is almost entirely re-recordings of some of their most popular songs. Why bother, really? This feels like Spinal Tap trying to go back to their glory day. David is a better vocalist at this point, so the re-recordings do bring a little bit new, but this is kind of only for the hardcore fans. And because it also functions as a kind of best of, it's only for the casual fans. The hardcore fans and the casual fans, only them. Then we have the most recent Spinal Tap album release, 2014's Tapped Out. Frankly, at this point, this is ridiculous. This is another album of just re-recordings of existing material. Some of them are literally just re-recordings. You can hear them put the vinyl needle down and they just recorded that. This release is frankly embarrassing. I think the microtransactions are a terrible idea. There is no reason for you to get that one. And this, sadly, is the most recent Spinal Tap release. The only things they've made since then are, well, there's Nigel's NFTs. And Derek made a pretty embarrassing solo album. Derek seems to be presenting himself as a comedy character. That's clearly a wig. This was a very inadvisable release. I think this tarnishes Spinal Tap's legacy somewhat. Because they have recorded some of the most guitar music in history. They're a widely loved band, and it's well deserved. Or it is, well, deserved. I had the privilege of resembling David St. Hubbins for the summer of 2018, but I got a cease and desist, signed by David himself. That's your guide to the best works. That's your guide to the works of Spinal Tap. Go and give it a listen, but give yourself breaks along the way. Spinal Tap. No other band leaves you wanting more. I just realized while editing this video that Spinal Tap might see this, and it probably comes across as quite critical. They'll be used to criticism. They'll be very used to criticism. But honestly, I'm such a big fan, and hey guys, if you ever need a drummer,